Someone is explaining an opinion you completely disagree with. Inside, you're already building a rebuttal. And yet your head is moving up and down, slowly, steadily, in complete agreement with words you don't believe at all. You tell yourself you're just being polite. But the real reason is far stranger. That nod isn't a decision you're making. It's a signal your body sends almost independently of what you actually think. Picture the scene. A coworker is pitching an idea you find shaky. A relative is explaining a belief you find frustrating. A friend is venting about a decision you privately think is a mistake. In each case, your face does the same thing. Slight tilt. Steady nod. Maybe a small thrown in for good measure. Meanwhile, somewhere behind your eyes, a completely different conversation is happening, one where you're disagreeing in real time. Why would your body perform agreement while your mind is doing the opposite? To understand this, you have to separate two things people usually lump together: nodding as a statement of belief, and nodding as a piece of conversational machinery. A researcher named Janet Bavelis, who studies how listeners participate in conversations, found that most of the small responses you give while someone else is talking, nods, murmurs, brief eye contact, aren't really about agreement at all. She called these signals listener responses, and found they serve a much more basic function. They tell the speaker, "I'm still here, keep going, I'm tracking what you're saying." That distinction matters enormously. A nod, in this context, isn't a vote. It's closer to a heartbeat, a small, repeated signal that keeps the conversation alive. If you stopped nodding entirely while someone spoke, most people wouldn't read that as neutrality. They'd read it as something being wrong, as if you checked out, or worse, as if you were quietly judging them. So your body keeps the rhythm going, almost automatically, regardless of what your internal monologue is actually saying. Here's where it gets stranger. This automatic nodding doesn't stay contained to just being polite. A psychologist named Solomon Asch ran a series of experiments in the 1950s that are still discussed today, where he asked participants to judge the length of lines while surrounded by actors instructed to confidently give an obviously wrong answer. A striking number of real participants eventually agreed with the group's incorrect answer, not because their eyesight failed, but because disagreeing out loud, in that moment, felt more costly than being wrong. Asch's line experiment wasn't really about lines. It was about how much social pressure it takes to override something you can plainly see with your own eyes. And if a room full of strangers can do that to your stated opinion about a physical measurement, imagine what a single ongoing conversation, with someone you actually know, can do to a nod. This is where a second piece of research becomes useful. A psychologist named Robert Cialdini, who spent decades studying influence and persuasion, identified something he called the consistency principle. Once people commit to something, even something small, like a physical gesture of agreement, they feel internal pressure to stay consistent with that commitment. Nodding isn't just an output of what you believe. It can quietly become an input, subtly nudging your own attitude toward whatever you were nodding along to in the first place. Think about how strange that loop actually is. You start nodding because it's socially expected, a way of keeping the conversation moving smoothly. But the nodding itself, repeated enough times during one conversation, can start to soften your internal resistance to what's being said. Not because you were persuaded by the argument. Because you were, in a small way, persuaded by your own body language. This helps explain something that otherwise makes no sense. Why do people sometimes walk away from conversations having agreed to things they didn't actually support? It's rarely because they were argued into it logically. It's because they spent the entire exchange performing agreement with their face and posture, and somewhere along the way, the performance started blending into the actual position. There's an interesting cultural layer to this too. In some cultures, a nod during conversation is understood almost universally as a listening cue rather than a statement of agreement, closer to saying, "I hear you," than, "I agree with you." In others, that same gesture is read far more literally, as an actual signal of endorsement. This mismatch causes real confusion in cross-cultural conversations, where one person nods purely to keep the exchange flowing, and the other later assumes an agreement was reached that was never actually made. The gesture itself didn't change. Only the meaning attached to it did, which is itself a clue that nodding was never a pure, universal expression of belief in the first place. It's a social convention, learned early, and applied automatically long after anyone stops thinking consciously about what it's supposed to mean. Of course, not every nod works this way. Context matters enormously. A nod during a casual chat about weekend plans carries almost no weight. But a nod during a tense negotiation, a difficult family conversation, or a workplace disagreement can carry real consequences, precisely because the other person is watching for exactly that signal, consciously or not, to gauge how much resistance they're actually facing. This is also why disagreeing in the moment feels so much harder than it should, logically speaking. You're not just contradicting someone's words. You're interrupting an entire nonverbal rhythm that's been running the whole time, one built specifically to keep things smooth. Breaking it requires more than having a different opinion. It requires consciously overriding a physical habit that's been firing since you were a toddler, learning that nodding kept adults happy and shaking your head sometimes didn't. Think about how early this pattern gets built. Long before you had fully formed opinions about politics, relationships, or work decisions, you already understood that a nod produced a warmer response than a blank stare or a shaken head. That association gets reinforced thousands of times across a childhood, then thousands more times across adulthood, until it stops being a conscious social strategy and becomes something closer to reflex, the same way flinching at a loud noise stops requiring any thought at all. This is part of why simply telling yourself to just be more assertive rarely works as well as people expect. Assertiveness advice usually targets the conscious, deliberate part of communication, choosing better words, holding eye contact, using a firmer tone. But it often ignores this quieter layer running underneath, the nodding, the small affirming sounds, the tilted head, all of which can undercut a firm verbal stance without either person fully realizing it's happening. You can say, "I actually disagree," in a clear, steady voice, while your head is still nodding along for momentum, and the mixed signal often lands with more confusion than either the words or the gesture would have on their own. So the next time you catch your own head nodding along to something you don't actually agree with, don't read it as weakness, or dishonesty, or spinelessness. Read it as exactly what the research suggests it usually is, a piece of social machinery running in the background, designed to keep conversations moving, that occasionally runs even when your actual opinion is pointed in a completely different direction. The gap between the nod and the belief isn't a character flaw. It's a mismatch between two different systems, one built for tracking conversation, and one built for holding opinions, that were never perfectly synced to begin with. If there's a practical piece to take from this, it isn't to stop nodding altogether, since that would make you seem checked out or hostile in most normal conversations. It's simply to notice the moment it's happening, especially in conversations where the stakes are higher than small talk. Noticing creates a small pause between the automatic gesture and whatever comes next, whether that's staying quiet, or finally saying the thing you've been holding back the entire time your head kept moving up and down. Someone is explaining an opinion you completely disagree with. And this time, you feel your head start its familiar rhythm. You notice it. And in that small gap between the nod and the next moment, you get to decide whether your face keeps speaking for you, or whether it's finally time for your actual voice to catch up.